Other publishing. Wade Franson is the host of Created in the Image of God, a series that examines the role of religion in society, from messianic returns to the emotive responses transmitted through our culture. Wade fearlessly addresses reality claims from all directions, objectively exploring their compatibility with Holy Scripture. Joining him is Daniel Sanderson, CEO of Planksip, an international philosophy and cultural media outlet, helping emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Tonight's episode, Camping with Kierkegaard, with J. Aaron Simmons.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Wade Franson. I'm your host of the Created in the Image of God show. Sadly, Dan Sanderson will not be with us tonight. He is still down in Mexico, related to family concerns, and will be hopefully back with us next week. We received word from him just today that he will be returning in the next couple of days. But no fear, we have a guest who can fill in for Dan as a philosopher. Tonight's guest, J. Aaron Simmons, who is by background a member of the Pentecostal church, Pentecostal movement, but his current career is teaching philosophy at the college level. And he has a book and a program called Camping with Kierkegaard. So we're going to welcome J. Aaron Simmons into the studio and dive into who he is, what he's doing, and we expect it to be a fascinating show. So should I call you Aaron?
Yeah, Aaron is entirely fine. Thanks so much for having me, and our thoughts, obviously, with Dan. But it's great to be with you, and honored to chat with you, man.
Same here. So let's dive right into talking about your Genesis story. Tell us a little bit about your roots. Tell us a little bit about, however far back you want to go in terms of where you come from, whether that's parents or grandparents or heritage, where you were born, just those, where are you coming from in cosmic terms?
There's a whole bunch of jokes I'm going to bypass, but yeah, so maybe the best way to put it, since obviously the intersection of my Pentecostal faith and then also my philosophical expertise and interests are kind of where we want to land tonight. I am a fourth generation Pentecostal. That's part of the heritage that I've inherited. As we say, I was teethed on the red back hymnals and grew up while, the old women would be opening their purses to hand me hard candy, and my mom punching my dad to make sure he wasn't falling asleep while just resting his eyes in church. But my grandfather, Ernie T. Height, was a pastor in the Church of God. And my mother grew up then as a pastor's daughter. My dad actually grew up also in the church. One of his brothers-in-law was one of the leading evangelists in the Church of God Pentecostal movement in the 70s and 80s. And so in my heritage, my Pentecostal identity is, you might say, deeper than religious faith. It's more about a kind of embodied awareness. The earliest memories I have are of my sister coming home from the hospital, and then a whole bunch of stuff in church. And so it's part of how I make sense of myself in the world, is having grown up in spaces where, we run and sing during service, and then we eat a bunch of spaghetti afterwards and play softball midweek. And so my Pentecostal background is definitely deep in who I am. And then it played out sort of forward by when I, was in high school. The most important thing in my world was playing drums. I was a professional drummer for a long time. And so touring with the youth group for the youth choir. Then I went to college at Lee University, which is the Church of God institution. My parents both had gone there. My dad was a professor at the university. And I toured all over the world playing drums for one of the campus choirs there. And while I was in college, I went to study physics, really wanted to be a physicist, loved math, loved science. But while I was there, a funny thing happened on the way to a physics major, and I got derailed while studying over in Cambridge, England for a while. and fell in love with the humanities and art, architecture, literature, drama, music, all of these sort of, ideas that humans had created as cultural artifacts, as cultural products. And so I ended up actually getting a degree in history, and then went on to Florida State University to get a master's in humanities and intellectual history. And it was there that I discovered philosophy as kind of the ideas that lay behind the art and the literature. And I thought, man, as much as I love studying, Titian's Northern Renaissance art and Boccaccio's Decameron and looking back at Greek tragedians, I'm not a poet, I'm not an artist, but I love the ideas lying behind what they produced. And so that kind of led me into philosophy. And so that's where I've spent the rest of my life and career. And so I now am a professor of philosophy and have been for 20 years or so. Most of my work is on, is on what's called continental philosophy of religion, which is other sexy words that might be frightening to people or really exciting. On postmodernism, I work on existentialism. I do a lot of work on religion after the death of God. So that's kind of where I find myself. And in that space,
and by after the death of God, I assume you're referring to a post-Nietzsche kind of scenario, or
right. So the idea being that if we're going to talk about God, religion, and faith, we're going to have to do so in a context of embodied meaning making. That the death of God is not an atheistic view, but it's this requirement that whatever we mean by God, it throws us back on our decisions in the world to live in certain ways, to find meaning in certain ways. And so I don't know, man, like all that stuff has just vibed with me. As I have said in many interviews, it was discovering the philosopher Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher who made Christianity possible for me in grad school. So I had been raised in Christianity, got to grad school, and suddenly the questions were different and deeper and more complicated. And the training I had received at a Christian liberal arts college was great, but it wasn't, in my opinion, kind of adequate to the wall that I was running into in Western intellectual thought. So
let me pause you there and go back a little bit, because we're right now on the cusp of something that I personally find really interesting and fascinating, and maybe so for the audience, and perhaps even enlightening for some in our audience. And that is the cognitive dissonance around the idea that, and that well, before I even unpack that, let me ask a more basic question. Tell us, what is the nature or essence of the Pentecostal faith, the Church of God movement, historically, and even in your day as a child, and has it changed at all in the last 30, 40, 50 years?
Yeah, well, so let me say out of the gate, I am not a church historian, nor am I a theologian. There are much better people qualified to address those issues. But I can say in the research that I have done, I've written some on Pentecostal philosophy and contributed to some of those debates. The church that I'm affiliated with is the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee. Though now my family, my wife and I, Vanessa, and our son Atticus, we attend an Assemblies of God church in Greenville, South Carolina. And the Church of God, Cleveland, the Assemblies of God, these are both similar enough such that the Pentecostal movement, I would say, is defined by less particular manifestations, which is the way it sometimes gets cashed out, and more, here I'm following the philosopher James K.A. Smith in his really cool book called Thinking in Tongues, where he says, to think about Pentecostalism is to think about an affective epistemology. If we're going to think about knowledge, it's embodied, it's felt, it's a way of living. It's not just affirming a set of propositions at the bottom of a faith statement so that you can teach at a Christian college, right? And so for me, Pentecostalism,
would you say that there's a distinction there between, let's say, experiential and practical?
Yeah, I would. I mean, but again, the words I'm going to use are affect. So it's a matter of embodied, felt which I know is unhelpful. But so experience can simply
not really. But again, I'm trying to bring it down a couple of levels.
Yeah.
Again, depending on the audience, because even if we have very educated audiences, they may not know what is really under those words, right? So when you talked about manifestations, I'm thinking, oh yes, in colloquial terms, they were called the holy rollers, right?
Yeah.
In times past. So unpack that. That's the popular conception. Unpack that a little bit for us. Get real here.
Mm-hmm. So right, Pentecostalism right now, and here I'll betray some of my critical lens on some of the contemporary movements in these ways. Contemporary Pentecostalism right now is unfortunately, and I mean this in all honesty, is unfortunately just a kind of subversion of predominantly white evangelicalism in the United States. Now, there are certainly African-American Pentecostal traditions that would stand differently here. But when we think of Pentecostalism as a kind of popular cultural thing, it tends, unfortunately, just to be conservative political commitments with a very, in my opinion, crass and unhelpful conception of the Bible as not only literalist, but a conception of God as absolutely authoritative, and then our awareness of Christian truth as certain. And all of those things are things that I find not only philosophically untenable, but maybe even immoral. And so when I talk about still being a Pentecostal, where I lean is that affective stuff. And so what I mean by that is Pentecostalism is not best understood as, believing that God shows up and people run the aisles and speak in other tongues and dance and, flip around and gold dust falls from the sky. Certainly does not mean let's go pick up snakes and drink some arsenic, right? But what it does mean is that the belief in a personal God who is personally invested in the lives of finite people like us, that personal meets personal encounter is likely to be something that is not just a head knowledge. It's not just a heart knowledge, as we used to say in church. It's more a full embodied investment. It's kind of like saying, I've been married to Vanessa for 22 years, and what it means for me to love her is just to affirm the proposition, I love Vanessa. No, it's to live in community with her. It's to navigate life. It's to be invested in her emotional states. It's to be affected by her life in ways that then make my life look different. And I suggest that Pentecostalism is best understood as that kind of mutual being affected by. We are affected by God's Spirit in the world, and God is affected by our investment in living that hope out as a commitment in the world. And
thank you. I think that's really well expressed, and it helps. I think it helps give a solid foundation for the next question, which is the question I was about to ask a few minutes ago, but then thought better. No, let's have you first explain kind of what that is. And the question is, do you feel tension between your faith as practiced in your community and your profession? And profession is an interesting term in this context, because I often say people can profess whatever they want, right? You can profess all day long your belief in Jesus,
right, but
what you do is actually proof of what you actually believe versus what you profess. But in this situation, I'm referring to your profession professionally, not your profession of faith, right?
Professing.
So do you feel a tension? I love words. Do you feel a tension between, not attention, like standing in attention, do you feel a tension between your faith as practiced and lived within your faith community and your profession, which is, I had an interesting conversation with someone recently about are academics more detached, right?
Mm.
And my answer was no, they're not at all, because they are vested professionally in proving that they're right. They can act all detached, right? And erudite and, well, I have no pony in this race. Sorry, pardon my French, the heck you don't. You
Mhm.
have every pony in this race, because your entire livelihood depends on you creating an aura of being right, even as you
Yeah.
say, well, we don't really know, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of almost disingenuous. But having said all that, tension between your professed lived faith in your community and your profession of being an academic, a professor of philosophy, no less. Are there those in your community who like, how can you who wonder how you do that and retain your faith? You're obviously
Yeah.
doing it, which is admirable, and one of the reasons I want you on this show to have this discussion.
Yeah, I mean,
But has there been tension as you take this path that you're going on?
maybe. So I would say, in order to answer that the best I can, I would just add to my account of Pentecostalism a historical claim that Pentecostalism in the early centuries of its prominence or emergence in America was deeply committed to social justice, was deeply committed to embodied flourishing for especially marginalized communities that were otherwise ignored by the power structures of the broader church. And it was aware of things like poverty as, a task for Christian living, right? And so I say that to say part of why I still cling to celebrate the heritage of 4 generations, why I'm trying to pass that on to my son and invite him into that heritage, is not because it connects us to predominantly white evangelicalism and conservative politics. That's actually something I want to eschew, but because it connects us to a lived tradition of people who were in many cases ostracized and outcast and rejected by the broader culture, but who found in their communities spaces to say radical hospitality, radical invitation is part of what the Christian life looks like. And so when I think of it that way, so that's the important qualifier, right? When I think of it that way, no, there's not any tension for me between my Pentecostalism and my postmodern philosopher of religion identity. Where the tension lies is in the churches that I have frequented over the years. There, again, because of what I would describe as a kind of neo-fundamentalist and evangelical usurpation of that interesting, compelling, deep, dynamic Pentecostal history, the churches tend to be much less interesting than that history. And as a result, I sometimes, not always, but sometimes get read as dangerous to the community because I think we can ask questions about things that they need to be, again, clear, certain, obvious, and unchallengeable. And my view is part of what I find so compelling, again, about this affective, embodied, felt manifestation of Christian hope is it causes us to be radically humble, radically hospitable, to eschew any conception of self-sufficiency, right? Egoism becomes deeply problematic and usually evil. And so in that space, I find myself certainly not as grand as Kierkegaard when he says he tries to bring Christianity back to Christendom. But I'm certainly sympathetic to that idea. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who says that he looks for a religionless Christianity because the religions of his day had sided with National Socialism. I find myself very in line with the Christian witness of Kierkegaard, Bonhoeffer, Martin Luther King, saying the task is a commitment to justice, lived neighbor love. And so in those ways, no, I see deep questions about the power structures that tend to restrict our thinking and make us idolaters, right? Where God becomes a reflection of our own interests. I'm radically opposed to that. It seems to me philosophy helps my faith. But some churches tend to see asking those questions as deeply disruptive to the particular manifestation of what you might call the patina of coherence that they present of themselves. So I have been, I admit, asked to leave, I think 5 different churches in my professional life. And in every case, it was because they saw the questions I was raising, never in inappropriate public spaces, throwing stones in the middle of services, but, like going to pastors behind the scenes saying, look, you're saying this. I'm a little bit confused. You're having a conference about gender and Christianity, but you don't have any women speaking. Is that a concern for you? Maybe we should rethink this. You're writing books about what it means to be inclusive to people of all sexual orientations, but you're not actually affirming of different sexual identities as having political and social rights. Like maybe we can think differently about this stuff. You claim that God can do anything and prayer changes stuff, but yet in your own faith statements on the website, you are a cessationist about divine intervention. Like it was trying to bring the talents that I think God has blessed me with. Doesn't make me right about any of it, but again, that critical lens to be able to think deeply about texts and ideas has not been met always with warm reception from some of the churches I have attended. Thankfully, we're at a church now, an Assemblies of God church here in Greenville, South Carolina. The pastor and I are good friends. He invited me during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 to do an online class about Christianity and racial justice. He and I have done Atheism for Lent together, where I would send him readings from different atheistic philosophers to help us rethink what it looks like to challenge our own preconceptions. He's an amazing guy who finds what I bring to the table a resource for thinking deeply and thinking well in community. And so I'm very blessed to be at a place now where even if I don't agree with many of the people at the church about things like political life, it's a church that is excited to have me and my family be part of that community. And I think that's something that is the only bar that matters. Can we love each other amidst disagreement? If that's true, then I'm in.
Yeah, my own experience mirrors yours in many ways. I think we shared in a previous meeting that I'm a former minister, resigned from the ministry to separate my faith from my paycheck, and had a similar experience as I had to choose where to fellowship and congregate. And I retained the role of lay pastor for a while. In other words, I was still speaking at churches for a while until I gave that up entirely as well. And had similar challenges. But what I want to do now is flip it and say, well, what about the converse of that in your professional life, bringing that religious background and that aspect of you to philosophy? Is there any tension there? Or is that, and if not, why not? Yeah. Because it should be no secret to anybody that that you would be equally hounded out of certain circles based on what you try to present and represent at that level, as you would be in certain churches. It might be done in different terms and in different ways, but just being disfellowshipped, being excommunicated would happen there as well.
So I definitely think the academy can run very much like a church. There's the professors that sit at the same lunch table and have for 65 years, and you don't mess up their pew. I mean, it looks very similar. There's, the people who have been there since this curriculum was adopted, and so they kind of carry themselves very much like people who were part of the launch team of the original church. I mean, there's lots of mirrors that we could play out. I think I'll say 2 things. One, I don't think anything productive comes of giving credence to the popular narrative that the academy is this space that is hostile to Christian belief or hostile to different ideas. That's just not been my experience. My experience has been the academy is hostile to people who are not critically thinking. So if your goal is to show up at a philosophy conference and think, well, everybody needs to listen to this view because this is the case, everybody there is like, where's the argument? What's the reasons for this view? That's uncompelling. We're moving on. So it can be a hard audience, but my experience has, if anything, been it is not nearly as difficult to be a Christian in the academy as it is to be a philosopher in the church. That said, my particular proclivity, so being a postmodern philosopher of religion, the debates in which I play certainly can find it perplexing that I still identify as a Pentecostal, that I still believe in a personal God, that I still understand prayer to be a kind of actual speech act in communication to the divine mind. Like, there are some things that I hold to be true that are perplexing to many of my fellow philosophers, just because they see these as kind of outmoded options. But that said, they're inviting me to publish in the books that they're editing, and I'm inviting them to publish in the books I'm editing. And so the debates that we have together are things that have created deep and standing friendships as we're all actually helping to shape the debates in the field. The only place I would say that this is the second point, that I would say there is some tension is I am certainly critical of what might be seen as the popular mode of Christian philosophy. So I'm not critical in the sense of I think that it's bad. I just think that it's bad strategy to do confessional stuff in the space where we are supposed to be giving arguments available to all members of the philosophical community.
Well, I was actually going to try to parse that out a little bit and ask, is it also because in the church congregation, you're bringing 100% of your whole self, whereas in the academy, you're bringing 40% of yourself, 60% of yourself, and nobody expects you to bring 100% of your whole self. That's not what it's about. You follow me? So there's a natural disassociation from certain parts of you that are private and that are expected to be left private, and in one sense have no place there. But in a church, you're bringing your whole person, your family, everything.
I mean, I love the way you phrase that. I'm not sure that I would agree I bring 100% of myself to church.
Well, you can't because you have the experience of being rejected and chased out. But the point is, you're expected to.
You're expected to. That's for sure, right? But I think my thought would be that if I brought 100% of myself to church, it probably would lead to more invitations to explore other churches.
Exactly.
So, but this is what's weird to me is, so Christian philosophy is a pronounced and influential space. So the Society of Christian Philosophers is one of the largest subgroups in the American Philosophical Association.
Interesting.
Amazing thinkers like Nicholas Wolterstorff, Alvin Plantinga, Linda Zagzebski, Marilyn Stump. There's been an amazing, Eleanor Stump, Marilyn Adams, has been an amazing resurgence or prominence of Christian philosophical thinking at the very highest levels for the last 50 or so years. My thought is most of that Christian philosophy, though not all, could be reasonably confused with theology. And I am not a theologian. And so I take very seriously that as a philosopher, I can actually compartmentalize my Christian commitments, not set them aside, but I can say, look, we can ask questions. Well, what if X is the case? Does Y follow? If we start, given that X is the case, some theological claim, at that point, I tend to get a little bit nervous. And again, I'm not suggesting all who go under the term Christian philosophy do this, but a lot do. And so where I have felt a little bit of
Well,
tension is actually
they're trained to do that versus that which philosophers are trained to do, and it's almost with the mother's milk, right? And they've never been disabused of that approach.
well, and that's where I would say the people I feel most uncomfortable around in the philosophical space. Again, I was on a regional board for the Society of Christian Philosophers. I respect this space. These are friends of mine, but I tend to feel most uncomfortable in the Christian philosophy spaces, not the postmodern philosophy of religion spaces. In the postmodern philosophy of religion spaces, I get read as way more conservative than I ever am. But in the Christian philosophy spaces, I get read as way more liberal than I probably am. And so being able to say, well, which space would I rather be misunderstood? I'd rather be misunderstood in that latter space where I'm perceived as conservative, which I'm not, but yet that confusion leads to, I think, really interesting conversations. And I'm happy to be in that space a little bit more often.
Yeah, so one of the learnings that I had on my personal journey as I sought to reconcile my own cognitive dissonance coming from a more fundamentalist background and figuring out how to embrace the intellectual challenges, the incoherence, and as Jesus told us to do, knock, and it shall be opened, seek and you shall find, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than already thinking I have found, right?
Right.
Right. But anyway, coming to the understanding that if all the covenants had a different sign, right? The Noahide covenant had the rainbow, the Abrahamic covenant had the circumcision, the Jewish covenant had the Sabbath. What was the sign of the Christian covenant? Well, there's a twofold sign, and I won't get into the first half of it. This is my opinion. But the second half of it, so the sign of the Sabbath day was by recognizing God as the creator of time, which was an advance over, God, the creator of the mountain, God, the creator of the lake, right? And God having his dominion on that mountain or in that geography. Having a God that transcends time and space is inherent in the idea of holy time, the seventh-day Sabbath. And by communing with God on that specified holy time, it was said, I will know who you are and you will know who I am. We will know each other because you recognize that I am the God of time and space. I am the God who created holy time, the seventh-day Sabbath. So what is the sign for a Christian then? Well, in my opinion, it was when Jesus said, by this shall all men know you in John 13:35, that being a statement of philosophical detachment, all men meaning the independent outside third party observer who is not one of you. It doesn't say by this shall all followers of me know that you are true. No, all men.
Right.
And is that you have love one for another. So when my church denomination split down the middle, that's when I resigned, separating my faith from my paycheck, because I didn't want to attach to either side. I didn't want to be in that argument as they split. I was a child of divorce, and I recognized the inherent essential destruction of one's faith by not being able to stay together. And then they further split and splintered into these squabbling fragments. And it became very clear to me through a spiritual dark period that we were not at all embodying that sign that you have love one for another. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, that you have love one for another. An outside independent third party observer looked at us and said, you've got to be kidding me. You guys, you're the most bickering, squabbling group of people I ever said, sending each other to hell figuratively over the tiniest, stupid little things. And now I kind of halfway forgot where I was going with that, other than that, again, this is that bringing that whole person and what is expected of religion, right? And the discomfort that you might feel in a Christian philosopher context
Mm-hmm.
where there are battling ideologies that are evident, that there's not that underlying unity and oneness that is emerging, other than in the shape of an us versus them. Well, we are against you. We are united in our opposition to an enemy. That's not what Jesus was talking about.
I think that's right. I mean, it's, and again, I think my thought is wanting first to make sure no one could ever misunderstand me as saying, "Oh, we poor Christians in the academy," like claiming abuse and marginalization. In my opinion, in America as a Christian, just is to misunderstand how power works, and you don't get to be thrown, you don't get to claim that you are excluded when in fact you have literally set the terms of the community in the first place. So I have not been excluded or kicked out or abused because of my religious faith in the academy. That's just not true. What I have felt is certainly it is the case that my postmodern, post-Nietzschean set of philosophical trainings have made the spaces that I play in there spaces where some of the specifics of my Christian commitments are certainly not dominant views. They're not majoritarian views in that space. And I kind of find that to be a compelling debate to be in. When I go to the Christian philosophy spaces, there's a lot of agreement about all kinds of things. But the way in which philosophy is done, as you say, when you start from we are doing Christian philosophy or Pentecostal philosophy, that's where I start getting really nervous and start bristling a little bit, because
but not your kind of Pentecostal philosophy, our kind of Pentecostal philosophy.
Right. I mean, and it's weird. Like, so I wrote a couple essays on Pentecostal philosophy, and two or three of them, my whole point was, I think Pentecostal philosophy is probably done best by non-Pentecostals. Because as soon as we start saying, well, where are the borders and where are the boundaries and who's in and who's out, now I don't think we're actually doing very interesting philosophy. And so neither are we living very interesting Christianity. So I'm with you. I think the by this they shall know you, like what I would have said if you said, what's the sign of Christianity? I said, well, neighbor love, like full stop. That's the sign. Sadly, I would say that right now, and I mean this as graphically as I'm about to say it, I think the single group that lacks neighbor love most publicly in America are white evangelicals. And so my deep suspicion of the tradition in which I was raised has caused me to cling to this. Again, that's why I meant the history of Pentecostalism gives me such resources to be critical of many of its current manifestations. And philosophy gives me the tools and the vocabulary and the conceptual resources to be able to say, oh, man, like the Christian thinkers I turn to when I am really struggling, all of them were really struggling with what it meant to be a Christian when the church seemed to be walking away from Christ. And so I certainly, again, would never say that I am anywhere in the same league as Kierkegaard, Bonhoeffer, or Martin Luther King, but I find a lot of encouragement reading their work that then propels me into, the work of James Cone talking about the God of liberation and the God of the oppressed. It throws me into the queer feminism of Wendy Farley, who says thinking of God as the invitation to beauty is something that we have lost, thinking about God as the king who destroys. It throws me to John Sanders, the theologian, who says thinking about the authoritative God has made us authoritarian humans. Thinking about a nurturant God makes us loving Christians. And so it's these resources that then allow me to make sense of what I would describe as the real stakes that confront us as thinking Christians today, trying our best to live into that love as the real sign of what it looks like to try to hope God looks like Jesus. And so that's where I would say church is hard for me. philosophy is hard, but it's not difficult in the sense of I don't feel like I fit. I feel like I fit there. It's just a hard discourse. Church, I am made often to feel like I don't fit, but I wouldn't say like, oh, poor me. I would just say, oh, shoot, maybe the church has got a problem when they are thrilled to have financial planners and high school football coaches teach all their small groups about marriage and family and, you know, how not to go into debt. But then a philosopher shows up and says, hey, I'd be happy to work with the leadership team about things like cultural awareness or what it means to talk to a postmodern set of assumptions. And they see this as disruptive, problematic, you know, dangerous to the community, you know. And so these days I do my best to keep my head down. And again, we're at a great church that loves me and my family. But I certainly don't see the church as the battleground for the philosophical work I'm doing. My new book, Camping with Kierkegaard, is not a Christian book. It's not written to the church. It is a book about finding faithfulness as a way of life existentially that one could then certainly take up in religious ways. But I've shifted my focus and my audience, hopefully to some good ends. We'll see.
Well, and that's a perfect segue to do what is overdue at this point. This has been a fascinating, long first segment. We're going to now finally go to our commercial break and really encourage our audience, who I assume has been listening very intently, because they certainly haven't been putting much in the chat. But I'm going to now encourage them to do so, because we're going to go to our first commercial break, which in this case is a little ad for your new book, Camping with Kierkegaard. And I want to encourage our audience to post your thoughts, comments, questions, so that we can decide which one of you is going to get a free copy of that book. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of Aaron Simmons after this message about his book.
Hey everybody, my name is Aaron Simmons, and I am a philosopher and also someone who loves spending time outdoors, in the mountains, on the rivers, at the campsite. I have just written a book called Camping with Kierkegaard, Faithfulness as a Way of Life, and I want to recommend it to you. It is not just for people who enjoy going camping, it's for anybody who feels overwhelmed by the pressures of a success-driven culture. By drawing on existential philosophy and putting it into practice in my own life, on the trails, in the rivers, and at the campsite, I invite you to consider what is worthy of your finitude. That question, I believe, is ultimately the question of philosophy and the question of finding purpose and intentionality in our lives today. So go pick up a copy, Camping with Kierkegaard, and I will hopefully see you on the trails.
And if you happen to be more of a quiet reader, philosopher yourself, and rather than contributing to the chat, just want to go buy this book, here is the QR code. You can point your smart device at this, turn the camera on, read it. It'll take you right to a place where you can buy this book, supporting both our guest and this program. So welcome back, Aaron, to the studio. And I'm going to dive into really probably the most important question that came from that video. And that is, what does finitude mean?
Yeah. So by finitude, I simply mean that the human condition is defined by two things. And the first is vulnerability. The second is relationality. So we are finite means our bodies are going to age, break, and eventually die. So we don't have an unlimited amount of time to do whatever we think is worth doing. And whatever we decide to do, we are relational precisely because we are not eternal, infinite beings, self-sufficient unto ourselves. We are dependent. We are longing for deep connection with others. So finding a way to navigate our finitude for me means taking seriously the decision of how to spend our time, given that we don't have unlimited amount of it.
Well, that leads me to a philosophical, theological question. If God is self-sufficient, which I believe God is, then why does he seek a relationship with us?
Yeah, so there's two ways to approach
And I ask
this.
you this, I guess, as a Pentecostal philosopher. Since you mentioned the importance of relating and
personal relation, so I think there's two ways to look at this. One is depending on what we mean by self-sufficient, which of course in some sense God would have to be, again depending on what we mean. It could be the case that we understand God's desire for a relationship as precisely maximally gratuitous. In other words, it is radically unnecessary, and therefore it's the kind of thing that maximally reveals the divine nature. God, in God's nature, is an outpouring of gratuitous neighbor love. And I find that really compelling, right?
Because gratuitous in the positive, not in the sarcastic, negative, cynical sense.
Right. Gratuitous in the sense that it's a matter of grace, right? Grace and gratuity become, this is a thing that is not demanded, but is given freely. And so if we think of God as graciously invested in us because love defines the divine nature, then I think it requires us to rethink what we mean by self-sufficiency. And this is sort of the second way we can look at it. Claiming that God needs us may not be an expression of lack in the divine, but it might actually be an expression of what it looks like for the divine to be inherently relational in itself. So I don't understand the Trinity. I don't think anybody does. But if one wants to articulate and affirm the Trinity, which Pentecostals tend to do,
the formulator of the Trinity, which I would say was the Catholic Church. I don't really believe Paul formulated the Trinity, for example. But the formulator of the Trinity, which is the Catholic Church, itself says that it's a mystery.
Right. I mean, and it certainly is a later theological development in the history of Christianity. And that's not to say that we should doubt it. I affirm the Trinity, right? I am a Pentecostal. I'm not a Jesus-only Pentecostal. I'm a Trinitarian Pentecostal. But what that then means
are there non-Trinitarian Pentecostals?
There are, right? So there are Jesus-only Pentecostals.
Is that an identified segment or group?
Yeah. You'll sometimes hear of Jesus only.
Are they considered binitarians or what?
That I don't know. I think the idea though for me is
because I would assume I'm asking sincerely. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Are they believers that Jesus is God and the Father is God? Therefore, they're binitarians, not Trinitarians.
Maybe more the sense that Jesus is God and God the Father in some sense just is Jesus, right? That there's not three persons in one. There's just one person expressed in the person of Christ, right? And again, this is not my specialty, the minor distinctions in Pentecostal theology. But the reason that I mention, if you affirm Trinitarianism, which I do, the cool thing that kind of flows out of it is God is not somehow lesser because God is radically self-contained as needing nothing else. God becomes more compelling precisely because God, even internal to God's self, God is three persons in a radical relation of love. And so if that's the case, maybe we should stop thinking of God as, sovereign in the sense that everything that happens is part of a particular meticulous providential plan of the divine mind, and instead start thinking of, look, God as sovereign, that sounds an awful lot like authoritarian models of leadership. What if we think of God instead as walking with, invested in, participating with? That doesn't get rid of claims of omnipotence. It doesn't mean we've got to challenge the idea that God still relates to time maybe differently than we do. But it does start to invite us to realize the best leaders are the ones who are also humble. And this is where then the kenotic or self-emptying manifestation of God in the incarnation becomes a maximal revelation of God's nature. So it's cool that if one finds the story of Jesus compelling, it's a story of the maximal expression of the divine is as radically humbled humanity. And that's not to say God is just human, right? But it is to say maybe we should stop thinking about self-sufficiency as this abstract metaphysical claim and instead think about radical relationality as not something we're trying to overcome in our humanity, but something that God models for us by becoming human. So the
so let me walk back a half step my question. When I said curious, I personally, of all the discussions that I find fascinating and interesting and want to get involved in, the nature of God is the least, because it tends to become a litmus test for religious people that they use to excommunicate each other, right? And therefore, that's why I don't like it. I personally find it intellectually stimulating, and I love the way you answered the question by getting into what it means and what it could mean. But I'm not here trying to have a theological debate that has people taking sides.
No.
And nor are you. I'm just saying, I just wanted, because some in the audience, and we have a broad audience, and we seek to have people who might have very strong beliefs in the Trinity or not in the Trinity. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, but I therefore want to make it practical, and I want to segue into a different question. By the way, some questions in the chat, we will get to them. We're not going to go on that particular tangent, but thank you for the postings that are coming in the chat. We will get to you. Don't worry. It's also a way of making you stay tuned, right? So that your questions will be answered later in the show. But I just don't want to get derailed, because I want to dig into this. So everything that you were talking about, I was just thinking Jesus, right? Because let this mind be in you, Philippians says, which was in Christ Jesus, who thought it not robbery to be equal with God, and emptied himself, right? And came to manifest exactly what it was that you were just talking about, right? God modeling for us those things that you were highlighting. But the aspect of this that I want to highlight here and dig into is the expectations of the people to whom he came, right? And this, by the way, will tie into something that your book is about. So this is a partial answer, I think, to Brian Chrisman, and we'll get to a full answer later. Your book is an effort to move away from idolizing success and achievement, right? Well, but that's exactly what the people to whom Jesus came were expecting. The fulfillment of all their prophecies, the conquering warrior king.
Right.
That's what they were expecting, right? To establish the kingdom of God, to establish the kingdom of the Jews as dominant. That's what they were expecting when Jesus came, and he completely and totally confounded their expectations by modeling something completely different. So why was it set up? And I apologize if I'm getting into an area of biblical studies that you're not really that well versed in. I don't know if you're the right guest to ask this question, but given that you were talking about Jesus, or about the Trinity in the context of modeling this radical humility, why was that expectation set up, and what was going on there?
Well, so in this way, I think that the question can also be applied to our contemporary world, right? So when I say I want to help us overcome the idolatry of success by embracing what I see as the virtue of faithfulness, I simply mean risk with direction, not cognitive assent to theistic propositions, right? So I don't mean it as a religious idea. I mean, we've all got to figure out what will matter to us given our vulnerability and our relationality. How then should we live? What are we going to do? What's worthy of the time we have? Choose wisely. That's the point of the book. I draw on existential philosophy to try to invite us into that space, and a whole lot of stories about me mountain biking and camping with my wife and fishing with my dad. But the way that links up to this Christian question of divine expectation, right, or cultural expectation, is why is it that any religious community would be all that enamored with worldly achievement and success? We might say, well, by definition, religion invites us to radically rethink the priorities for human existence. And yet,
lay not up treasures on earth, right? Where moth corrupts and thieves steal.
And yet, like, apparently moths corrupt and thieves steal, but not on the Supreme Court. So let's fight to make sure those people look like us, right? I mean, notice success logic may not just be about how do I get rich. It's about how do I wield power to make sure that a particular vision of the world is deployed as unquestionable. And it's not surprising then that the same temptation that would have been in play, when Jesus shows up in the Christian story, is the same temptation with which we are also tempted today, which is, look, it is really seductive to think that your view of the world is the only reasonable option. And so if you think your view...
But let me stop you there for a second and share a little story. I was in Leningrad. Some of the audience here knows this story because I've shared it a couple of times. I was in Leningrad, 93. There was a program. I was with the Worldwide Church of God, which is not directly related to the Church of God movement, but kind of. You may know who and what they were, but we were opening up the Soviet Union to religious worship by feast sites in which we would celebrate the 8-day fall festival of Sukkoth, the Jewish festival, which we kept as Christians. This is all just elaborate geeky background, but the point is we were behind the Iron Curtain before the wall came down, doing religious work. And along with that, we had seeded a program in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, of helping bring in Western programming into the Soviet Union. And lo and behold, now there's suddenly a coup and Gorbachev was abducted. At the exact moment where I, as the pastor of the church in Estonia, in addition to a lot of other things that I was doing in Europe, was on my way to visit this little group in Leningrad. And of course, this was pre-internet, this was pre-cell phone. I got a fax or a phone call, I forget, when I checked in with the home office saying, there's been a coup, don't go. Right? And I was in Sweden at the time, planning to head in through Finland. And I said, are you pulling our people out? And they said, no, they're staying there to show solidarity. They don't want to have developed this relationship with a year and then flee at the first sign of danger. They're staying. And I'm like, if they're staying, I'm going. Click. Right? So stupid, hot-headed, young punk, right? So I head in through Finland, and I literally have this like Star Wars Obi-Wan Kenobi moment at the border crossing where it felt like nothing to see here, and I was waved through. But there was confusion. Wow. They didn't know who was in charge. And now as I'm driving towards Leningrad, the streets are deserted. And I didn't know tanks were coming from the other direction, from Moscow. And for those who know that history, they stopped 50 miles outside of Leningrad, laid down their arms and said, we are not opening fire on our own citizens. Been there, done that. And at that moment in time, through Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost, unlike perhaps today's Russia, that's what they did at that time. And so I'm coming in, they're coming this way, and I dodged not a bullet, but a tank-driven missile, and actually met with all these people. So all that is just backdrop to the story and the point that I'm going to make. So here I am sitting talking to these young, educated, I speak Russian badly, but their English was far better than my Russian. So we conversed in English. Young Western-oriented intellectual leaders here at the TV station. And this is when I had an epiphany, because I'd been in Estonia, I'd been in Poland, I'd been in Hungary, I'd been in Czechoslovakia. I knew how deep the hatred was of the Russians, right? My cousin who lived in Sweden, he used to joke about the Baltic Sea and the submarines that would patrol there. He'd say, they're making sure that people don't come en masse into the workers' paradise, right? No, that's not what the subs were there, right? They were shooting at their own people who were trying to escape, right? As well as protecting their nation. Anyway, so the point is, the hatred of Russia is so deep, and yet these guys are like, in this moment of crisis, these satellite nations will return to Mother Russia, right? I'm like, are you kidding me? Do you have any idea of the madness that you're saying? This whole story is to make one point. This is when I realized everybody thinks they're right.
Yep.
Everybody thinks they're right. So it's not just those in power who think they're right. Every human being thinks they're right. Every human being thinks that what they believe is right. Otherwise, they wouldn't believe it.
I think that's true, but power shifts your ability to think what's right and invites you now to deploy it as an obligation or expectation on the thoughts of others.
Completely agree. And to go back to the Bible, this is how I understand the entire story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. In the book of Genesis, the serpent has the ability to whisper, to suggest, to influence. But when that serpent grows up, it becomes the dragon of the book of Revelation. And how does it become a dragon? Because the whispering and the suggesting over time leads to large groups of people believing the same thing and giving political power to those ideas.
Yeah. And what we see, I think, in the person of Christ, and what I would hope we see in my account of faithfulness is, look, the goal is not to eliminate power. That's part of the logistics of social life. The goal is to rethink power as the goal, right? So what if we look at the person of Jesus, what we don't see is somebody who says, look, be an influencer, get as big an audience as you can, make sure you've got some jets and a really good marketing agent. Like, what we see is a guy who more or less says, you know what, I'm gonna go hiking and I'm gonna hike through a bunch of deserts and mountains, and I'm gonna go fishing quite a lot. And I'm gonna hang out with people who fish and people who hike and people who know what it looks like to have calluses on their hands, and not because the rich.
So you're saying that his miracle of the loaves and fishes was not to spread his influence and make him more attractive, but it was genuine concern for the people.
These people were hungry, right? and and again, it's not that there's a lack of concern for the rich young ruler, right? We also see Jesus talk to that guy. Yeah. It's just that the rich young ruler's set of social blinders are such that his theory of self-sufficiency, I don't even need anything other than me because I've got all this power, I've got all this money, made him blind to the invitational message that says, look, dude,
absolutely,
it's maybe not about
the church of Laodicea, right? Rich and increased with goods. But that richness is not, in that analogy, in my opinion, physical, material riches. They were wealthy. It was a wealthy community, but it was rather the fact that they thought they knew it all. They thought they had all the answers. They were rich in knowledge, in understanding, in their own minds, right? And maybe they did have an abundance of knowledge and revelation, and yet they counted that wealth as theirs.
Right. I mean, so One of the things that I say in the book, I have a whole section, a lot of sections actually, about humility as a virtue. But at one point I say, humble people don't practice enough often, but they acknowledge that fact and then keep practicing. Being on the trails, right, whether mountain biking trails or hiking trails, whatever, fosters an ethic of humility because we are constantly reminded of our smallness, our frailty, and our limitations. But as Socrates reminds us, humility is not at odds with confidence. It is the condition for appropriate confidence. So part of what I want to do is to invite people to realize, whether Christian or not, again, the book is not written for Christians. It doesn't defend Christianity. There is a chapter about my conception of God. There's a lot about Kierkegaard's Christianity, but it's meant to be an invitation to everybody to think about, are you living a life that you are okay with living, even if crap happens, right? Are you right now living toward the person you hope to become? And are you invested humbly in realizing wherever you stand, whatever you choose to be the direction of your existential risk, there are a lot of other reasonable places you could have stood. And that awareness invites what I see as what's called share the trail mentality. If you're an outdoors person, it's horseback riders, bikers, hikers, all these fisher people, like we're all on the same trails. It's not the mountain bikers trail. It's not the horseback riders trail. It's not the motocrossers trail. Because when that starts to happen, any one of those communities will mess up the trail for the other communities. Right? The mountain biking trail will start being really bad to hike on because it's really dangerous. The trail where you've got people running dirt bikes will absolutely destroy the trail for mountain bikers because it's going to blow out the corners and make your berms absolutely no longer work. So beginning to think about, in order to walk the trail with confidence, I've got to realize sometimes the most confident thing I can do is know when to step aside to let the biker pass so I can keep walking safely, right? And this is what I think is modeled in the person of Jesus, right? But you don't have to turn to Jesus to see that model. I think just spend time in the outdoors, you're going to learn these lessons. And so I try to appropriate from existential philosophy an awareness that says these lessons actively contribute to a life where joy is possible despite the temptations to despair. And isn't that kind of what we see in Jesus, right? Jesus comes and says, I come to give you joy and have it more abundantly, but my cross is still one you carry to the cross, right? Like, right. How is it you do both? Well, it's being able to say, I'm good, I'm okay, it is well with my soul, though seas billows roll. Like, despite the fact that jumping off that rock genuinely might break my collarbone, knock on wood, it's still the fact that not jumping off the rock, I'm not engaging risk. I'm just choosing which risks are worth engaging. That's the question of human existence. And I think Christ's example is one that models for us what it looks like to walk with others as we walk in light of impending death. That's not a thing that wrecks us. It invites us.
Yep. I really love everything you've been saying the whole show, everything you've just said. I love the trail analogy. We're already at the end of the official show. We got to get into some of the comments, but I want to play one more word from our sponsor to tie in what you're doing with the camping with Kierkegaard. Also, one of the major sponsors of this show, the Royal Falcon Foundation, some of the camps that are going on. So I'm going to play a quick message that talks about that keeping it real, because ultimately Jesus, God has given us the revealed word, but then Jesus is the word. He's given us revelation in the form of the Bible, but this planet, his creation, is the greatest revelation, right? And it is the greatest book that we are invited to study. And science, philosophy, we're really just beginning to learn the language necessary to study that greatest book of Revelation, which is the creation itself, and to read it accurately, right? The two great commandments that Jesus spoke of, were to love God and love your fellow man. But there were two great commandments way back in the Garden of Eden that have a similar dynamic, which is dress and keep the garden and be fruitful and multiply, right? Become the most invasive species the world has ever known. Sure, go for it. But at the same time, don't destroy the planet, right? And we're all struggling with figuring this thing out. And so the experiential camps of the Royal Falcon Foundation, what you're talking about with the camping with Kierkegaard, there's really a synergy here. I want the audience to be able to see this in this context, to write in, engage with us in some of the programs that are going on nationally. And then we're going to come back, look at the audience, and make sure that someone walks away with a free copy of your book after this show. Stay tuned. We will be right back to wrap this all up.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Visit our website and embrace a world of possibilities today. RoyalFalconFoundation.com.
And there's a QR code that you can use to scan in and let it take you there and learn more about it. There are also some other videos from some of the camp programs. And we'll be talking more about that as the months go on. We've got some really cool things planned for next year that hopefully we'll have some of our guests involved in various parts of the nation, and also many of the people in our audience. So thanks for sticking with us in this romp through Rambo philosophy, theology, just diving in and with gusto. It's been just a pleasure. But it would be an injustice if we didn't look at some of the audience comments and make sure that that one of you is awarded a book. So we've got a few of the comments here. One person who hopefully is still out there and patiently waiting for an answer to this. Actually, that wasn't it. That wasn't the actual question. Here was the question from Brian Chrisman. So, Aaron, would you consider camping with Kierkegaard as intending to facilitate what C. Stephen Evans calls Socratic spirituality in its readers?
Yeah, it's a good question. Hello, Brian. Hope you're doing well. So what Steve Evans means by Socratic spirituality is effectively a way of thinking about our spiritual life in a broadly philosophical sense that doesn't necessarily open on to the determinant religious commitments of something like Christianity or Islam or a particular version of Judaism, etc. And in some ways, maybe, Brian, I don't think I forget. I don't think I actually use the word spirit or spirituality very often in the book. Maybe I do and have forgotten. I tend to think of it more. I mean, so I think that's a fair analogy, but my view would be more like I'm trying to invite the reader to recognize the stakes of existence that are much higher and much more compelling than our particular cultural context would lead us to believe. Our cultural context wants us to understand, hey, if you make a lot of money, if you are successful, if you have a big audience, if you gain power and influence, you now live a life of meaning. And what I want to suggest is a life of meaning may be radically disconnected from those sorts of successes. Those are great. It's good stuff. But maybe a life of meaning is being okay with the life that you have lived. And that's a question that maybe is a kind of Socratic spirituality. I would just say that it's a kind of existential invitation that our success-driven culture often ignores. And so if you want to think of that as a kind of spiritual invitation, cool with me. I'd rather talk about an invitation to faithfulness as a willed commitment that says, hey, what direction do you think is worth the life that you're living?
He had also further clarified his question. I don't know if this changes anything or if you'd seen this comment as well.
Yep. Yeah. The comments aren't showing up on my side, Wade. So yes, definitely throw them up when we're talking about them because I can't see them. Yeah, right, Brian. So the problem, in my opinion, with religiousness A for Kierkegaard, this is a little bit technical, but give me 2 seconds to get in the weeds, and then the audience can take out their earplugs. Religiousness A is often understood as a broad sense of a non-Christian theism. It's a way of being related to or understanding the concept of God, even believing in the concept of God or the idea of God, but it not being played out in specific revelatory ways that would then lead one to the content of Christian consciousness, which is what Kierkegaard calls religiousness B. My worry, again, is if by spirituality, Socratic spirituality, we mean a kind of general existential philosophical investment with the affective, spirited dimensions of human existence, I'm all in. If we mean anything that looks like the goal is a kind of theism to some extent, then I'm out, even though I'm a theist. Because what I'm trying to encourage is not that people realize real faith is a kind of move toward theism. I want to say genuine faithfulness might be living atheistically on purpose with a commitment to neighbor love as a manifestation of meaning in the world. Okay. It might be going to the beach instead of going to the mountains. Sounds good to me. Like, I choose the mountains. It might be, as Wendy Farley says, letting the song in your car end before you get out and go into the office in the morning. Like, the layers at which I'm trying to invite people, it's not somehow trying to enter any kind of creep towards something like Christianity being the fulfillment of it. It is for me, again, that's where we've spent this whole conversation talking about the way my faithfulness gets maximally played out in my Christian walk, but that is not where the book is trying to lead people, or what I am kind of, leaving breadcrumbs for people to follow.
I think we're going to end up with a subsequent show because you've said some things and I'm now debating whether to get into them or not. And I'm saying, no, don't get into them. We don't remotely have time, but we're going to have you. We're going to have you back.
Happy to do it.
Let's jump to the next person here. John Lee.
Hey, John.
Sorry, John, you've just shown us you clearly don't need a copy of his book because you already have one. But your question is great anyway. On page 42, when we walk with others, we are actually invested in becoming the person that walking with them is likely to make us. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, thanks, John. Thank you so much for buying the book, reading the book. I hope you are enjoying it. Please reach out to me via my website if you've got further questions. I'd love to be in touch with you. So, yeah, the thought is our relationality is also a decision. And so, as I sometimes say, the direction in which you walk maybe sometimes isn't even as important as with whom you walk. And so choosing to walk with the people who invite you to become the person you want to be. Today, I had a conversation. This is weird or fortuitous or providential or something. I had 2 students follow up with me today after class, and they said, Dr. Simmons, can you come grab a cup of coffee with us? And I said, no, because coffee is gross, but I will drink some tea. So we went and had some tea, and they wanted to know about ethical friendship and what it looks like to be in ethical friend relations. And my account was, look, this is basically Aristotle's notion of the virtuous friend. It's simply the idea that the people who are genuinely your friends are as invested in helping you be virtuous as you are invested in helping them be virtuous. It's a relationship that is not just anchored in the use of each other for some sort of end. Hey, help me study for my math test if you'll help me study for physics. Nor is it a relation of pleasure, right? we both enjoy mountain biking, and so we're good friends because we help each other get to the mountains. It's that we're invested in each other being as good as possible, as virtuous as possible. And that's the idea of with whom you walk matters. It's what Aristotle meant when he says that we should find people of practical wisdom who help us understand examples of how we might want to live. It's what Socrates means when he ultimately says that the relationships of our conversation partners help shape the thoughts that we think through, right? So in all of those spaces, when you are on trail with somebody, you're talking to that person, but you're also on trail with somebody that you're now trusting not to make really stupid decisions, right? Somebody who's not going to increase the risk unnecessarily, not somebody who's going to goad you on to go smack the bear, somebody who's not going to push you off the cliff, right? Like the idea is you invest who you want to become by surrounding yourself with people who invite that kind of self to emerge. If I'm around kind people, I'm likely to start developing the virtue of kindness. If I'm around people who are selfish and egoistic and power hungry, I'm likely to start seeing those as goods that I want in my own life. And so we should choose really carefully who we're going to get on trail with, who we're going to spend our life working with, and what are the real goals of that work. And so hopefully, John, that invites a little bit of, we should be with people who encourage us to be the people we want to become.
So thank you. I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, following up on that question. So one of the books in the program that we do with the camps, Royal Falcon Foundation sponsored, is Unity and Diversity, right? And in the little book that we use, there's this picture of a circle, call it the circle of truth, and then each of us is like an egg shape, partly in, partly outside that circle of truth, coming at it from different perspectives. And in the initial image, there's no overlap. Everyone has a piece of the truth. Everyone is partly living in error. And the parts of our truth that we have don't even overlap. So we're not in agreement, right? And we're very diverse. Mm-hmm. But over time, through fellowship communion, we all move to where we're more within the truth and less outside the truth. And then you also have more overlap, right? But how do you manage the idea of, well, I want to be around people who are expressing kindness. I want to be around people who have these different virtues. Mm-hmm. But how is that different from getting in an echo chamber with people?
Mm-hmm. Because
it's a good, how does one avoid that problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because people who model what I describe as the three trail virtues, humility, hospitality, and gratitude, are the kinds of people who, when we walk together, we push each other away from complacency about how we walk. So the idea is, I genuinely think it's possible to be kind and inhospitable. But then I would say, well, but it's kind of a weak version of kindness. Yep. And it's possible.
Maybe it's an overemphasis on tough love, right? As a form of kindness.
Right. And I want to say that genuine hospitality is an invitation not just to people who already agree with me, but to people who say, y'all's circle of truth is kind of a dumb circle. There's a really cool triangle over here that y'all are missing out on. And it seems to me that we don't have to say, oh, well, screw the circle. I'm a triangle person now, to be able to say, you know what? We should invite the triangle people to walk with us a lot more, because they help us understand what it is we're actually claiming as circle. Of course,
people. It's the whole point of the circle of truth, though, right? call it the amoeba of truth. It doesn't matter,
right?
But, it's funny how people can, they'll have a peep. With however many billion of us there are, there's always going to be somebody who's going to come at it very differently.
Well, Jacques Derrida, the deconstructive philosopher who I talk about in the book in passing, but he says at one point that for a democracy to be worthy of its name, it would have to be a Christian democracy. Now, he is a Jewish atheist. The philosopher friends, it's a little bit more complicated than that, of course. But for our purposes, he's a Jewish atheist.
Okay.
And he says a Christian democracy is the only kind of democracy that would be worthy of the name democracy. And what he means by that is because it would have to be so hospitable that it invites even the enemies of democracy to be part of the conversation about social futures.
Right.
And man, that's a big ask. That's a hard
what he's
issue.
really doing is he's magnifying the term Christianity,
yes,
to mean what Jesus claimed to be bringing.
And
so
Jesus
again, getting back to
life
John
models. That's right.
Exactly. So okay, so getting back to a couple more questions. I'll jump ahead and go to this one because it ties into this particular theme.
Okay.
This is from Jet. Everybody thinks they are right. So it was obviously from that part of the show. Does it imply that older people who have thought more are more difficult to change? Ergo, efforts to create change will be more fruitful if focused on the young?
Wow, such a good question. I'll call you Jet. I don't know if that's your name, might be your initials, but I don't want to say yes to this just out of hand. What I would rather say is there is a long history of philosophy that suggests it takes a long time to develop the wisdom to be open appropriately to what it looks like to be confident and yet revisable. So Aristotle,
I love the way you said that, because there's a huge trap in everything we've been talking about.
Yeah,
and
I mean,
I love how you define that.
So I don't at all want to say like, nah, the old people, they're stuck in their ways. You know what? One of the things that has surprised me about this book and the audience that it's starting
nor do we want to say that the young gullible influential minds are the ones who are going to lead us in the right direction.
It has stunned me and been so personally rewarding to see the number of people who reach out to me in their 70s, even their 80s, saying, thank you for the book. It's inviting me to understand, even though I've been retired and lots of society tells me I'm past my useful days, there is a lot that I have to contribute. There's a reason I get out of bed. Faithfulness is a constant task. It's not something that is just for my productive years. And that is so cool to hear, right? It's heartwarming in all kinds of ways. But at the same time, as you say, the young, though I certainly I have spent my life talking to college students, right? I think there's great optimism and hope. And there is often some adaptability and a wow, for the first time, we're realizing there's more to the world than we might have been led to believe. This is really cool. Let's try new stuff on. That's true. But it's also the case that the young mind sometimes, not always, again, all kinds of counterexamples exist. Sometimes the young mind is so adaptable that it actually is not appropriately resistant to certain kinds of influence. And my best example for this is the fact that anyone wears Birkenstocks or thinks Ugg boots are attractive. My wife, of course, thinks they both are good things. But it's like, man, no, Birkenstocks are just ugly to me. But yet, well, hey, if these influencers are saying do this thing, they're all in, right? So I don't want to suggest that old people are somehow unchangeable. They might just be wise, but they also might be obstinate.
Well, no, that's a micro version, but there's also a macro version that's very, very terrifying, right? So you talked about Jesus in the sense of somebody who walked around and with fishermen, and I forget exactly the words you used, but the point is he basically chose a few disciples and then infected them with the ideas of his teachings, and then lo and behold, a few hundred years later, every now is indeed bowing to Jesus, because even kings are being coronated in his name, and they're bowing the knee and receiving their kingdom in the name of Jesus, right? So his ideas were powerfully viral, and this virus went deep, right? It went deep. People were willing to give their lives for this idea.
Yeah.
But many bad ideas are viral, right? And there's history is littered with them. The Red Guards of China, right? The Hitler Youth. And we could go on and on about how entire generations of young people have swallowed wholesale some really, really bad ideas.
Yeah, no, I think I guess my thought would be, Jet, that it cuts in both directions a lot. So do I have a lot of hope in younger generations? Heck yeah, because they have the most to lose and maybe the most to gain by being better at stuff than we have been. When it comes to climate change, I fully think our hope has to be in younger generations, because so many of us have just missed that. We've let that ship sail. But when it comes to a lot of things, I think let's not be too quick to ignore the wisdom that can come from people whose lived experience is richer and more dynamic. And the fact that they land in certain spots doesn't mean that then younger folk should land where they land, but it might be that they can learn an awful lot from those experiences that they haven't yet had. So my hope would be that we find ways for real conversation to exist. Unfortunately, notice the way we work politically. We oppose these two communities and we say, well, they are the problem. They're ruining society. And so you end up then having, if you're over this age, you watch this news channel. If you're under this age, you listen to that, Spotify playlist. Like, I would rather us find ways not to meet in the middle, but to be able to recognize why people stand in different spots, and then say there are some ideas that are genuinely evil, genuinely devastating to social flourishing. But there's an awful lot of ideas that I think are wrong that are actually possibly right. And that's where, again, those trail conversations become way more compelling, so long as we can still nest ourselves in a trust that we are mutually invested in the good of the other.
Well, this comment from John Pilt seems to be apropos. It's from some time ago in the conversation, but I think it was, talking about the serpent growing up and becoming the dragon, right, politically. But power magnifies what you already are. Money and power are mere tools that show what is in your heart already. But it's the same with ideas, right? They might seem great in a classroom, but watch what they do when they infect an entire populace, and suddenly
might be more complicated. Yeah, I mean, thanks, John, for the comment. I think the idea of money and power being tools is exactly right. The word I use in the book is that success needs to be worried about when viewed as a logic, as a way of understanding value. But success is a really good idea when understood as a matter of logistics for a particular hope that we have, right? So money and power can sometimes just be logistic realities that have to be navigated in order to pull off a civil rights campaign or a social justice rally. And I don't want to make it look like that these are necessarily bad. What I do want to suggest is, as soon as those become the goals that determine your theory of value, it's really easy to then think people who lack money are now somehow less than human, or don't count as much, or their lives are less significant. And they're probably to blame for their lack of having certain types of social status. And now I think we've gone off the rails in immoral directions. So my worry is not one that says necessarily down with capitalism, say. I actually kind of like the idea of Aaron James that there are models of leisure capitalism that are pretty compelling, because what they do is say, what if we stopped desiring monetary status and rethought money as logistically facilitating human agency in ways that then don't allow us to categorize human existence as those who have free time and flexibility and those who have to work 3 and 4 jobs to make sure that they're able to pay bills that they're tragically unable to pay because of the structure that says the more money, the better your life. So I appreciate the comment. I think you're probably right. It amplifies what is already in our hearts. My version of saying that is success cannot be a value theory that is then a logic by which we live. It will necessarily ruin us. But it can be a logistic reality. You really want to be a physician? Well, you're going to have to go to college. You're going to have to get to med school. But if you think, I am better now because I'm a doctor, dang it, now I'm out, right? Logistics, not identity when it comes to these sorts of ideas.
Here's an interesting comment from Cameron Cowan. It's hard to harmonize the older generation with the younger right now because of how much things have changed. Much of the lived experience simply isn't relevant. Is the pace of change affecting this, and how do we bridge that? It's like the generation gap, in a sense, isn't as pronounced as it was in the 60s ideologically, but perhaps it's way more pronounced because of the speed of change.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron, so much. This is a really important point. I think it's not just the speed of change, though that is certainly exponential. It's also, I think, the ways in which that change then gets lived out. So if you think about, the advent of something like the telephone, which connected now people in ways that formerly would have taken days. Now we can pick up the phone and call somebody around the country, around the world. That's an amazing move. You think about the development of the airplane. Suddenly, things that were months away are now hours away. But notice what's happening now. It's not just that things have exponentially increased relative to how fast they're changing. It's the kind of change now has radically interrupted what our daily practice looks like. And again, go back to my definition of Pentecostalism as an affective mode of knowing. My son, who has a professor dad and an amazingly brilliant mother, my son, man, we have read to him since he was in the womb. Lord of the Rings was being read to him when he was, not able to roll over on his own. And this kid would so much rather watch YouTube shorts all day long because his very mode of existence is one that does not understand the time it takes to create an imaginative world. For him, okay, I'll do that in Fortnite. I'll do that over here in some video game, right? Minecraft. But he's not going to do it in the space that I think is so radically important. And so what I've had to do is rethink, all right, well, is it just that I can't identify with him? Or is it that the mode in which he is living out his imagination looks very different than the mode in which my imagination played out? And then I can maybe find moments where I say, oh, things are really changing. The way it's impacting our daily lives is radically transformed. But it's not the case that we've shut down the imagination. We've got more temptations maybe to let it get shut down, right? But it's the idea that maybe there are ways to then say, okay, how can I then maybe see video games, hypothetically, as a resource for getting my son excited about envisioning different possibilities? What if he started thinking about social justice the way he thinks about Minecraft worlds? That's actually a pretty cool philosophical notion, what's called modal logic and possible world semantics. Like maybe it's not just speed, it's the way this gets lived out, but the way it gets lived out invites us to find deeper moments of connection that then open new ways forward. That's my hope. Because if I don't hope that, I get despair real fast. So thanks, Cameron. That's my suggestion, maybe.
Yeah, I was actually, as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, that's a very hopeful, positive way of looking at it. But my dark side was going towards the Sackler family and how they found a way to have little time release capsules. And change the entire nature of the healthcare system
Yep.
to focus on the patient's lived experience with pain, and addicted millions of people to opioids.
Yep.
So again,
which is evil, and I would encourage people. It's certainly R-rated in many ways, so don't just like grab your 7-year-olds and watch it. But the new Netflix series, Fall of the House of Usher, which is this sort of modernizing of an Edgar Allan Poe story, is all about the corruption that is involved in that very kind of activity. And so the Sacklers actually are kind of loosely the backdrop upon which the House of Usher is now based. And it is tremendous for exposing the way in which a simple desire, what would it look like to live without pain? That desire becomes something that then creates unbelievable suffering, but it's suffering that now is ignored because the wealth and power and status that it has yielded make them almost immune to any real guilt relative to their behavior. And that's the thing that I think is problematic. As my brother sometimes says, America is the country where you are guilty until proven rich. And I think that's you got to rethink the world if that's true.
Well, I recently sent a note to myself. I'd like to do a workshop that takes the lyrics from a Bob Dylan song, which was off of one of his bootleg albums, the bootleg series. I don't know if anybody knows it, but Who Killed Davy Moore? You know that song?
I've heard it, yeah.
So Who Killed Davy Moore is, and I got to look up the history again. I remember doing this like 20 years ago when it first came out, but Davy Moore is a boxer, I believe a real boxer, but whether it's real or fictionalized, a boxer who was killed in the ring. And Bob Dylan, the folk singer, is asking, who killed him? Who killed Davy Moore? And then the first person, well, it wasn't the promoter. He said, I'm not the one that struck him down. And he gives his justification. And then the crowd it wasn't us, and they give their justification. And then his manager, it wasn't me, and he gives his justification. It wasn't the gambler who bought the ticket. I bet on the other guy anyway. It wasn't me who killed him. And, it wasn't the other boxer that killed him, and the other boxer came from Cuba, where boxing has been outlawed. And that got a huge, applause for the audience that loves to loathe America. But especially, anyway, the point is systemic thinking, right? We all killed, they all killed Davy Moore. But none of them takes responsibility for it. And Davy Moore killed himself. He bears also responsibility for his choices. He might have been a victim of something that should have never happened, but that doesn't absolve him of his personal responsibility either. You don't blame the victim, but the victim is often not blameless, depending on what kind of a situation you're talking about. Now, I'm not to say that obviously there are victims,
right?
But the victim, as we view victims in modern society, the victim is often not blameless.
Well, and this is the point of existential freedom, right? Is that it continues regardless of our circumstance. The way that I narrate this sort of example from the book, I say, according to the success orientation, only if we achieve X or do Y or obtain Z do we think we will have enough, indeed ever be enough. And yet, as David Foster Wallace so aptly explains, this approach to living will inevitably leave us empty. We will never have, do, or be enough to satisfy the insatiable hunger for more, for the next thing, for what we lack. And that's the thing where, to Cameron's point, I would want to suggest that we've allowed the insatiable desire to be on a much, much, much shorter time loop, right? With the move of technology. Now, hey, you've got a cell phone. Well, we've got a plan that lets you renew it every 6 months.
It's also being constantly fed the desires, right? It's endless how much we can desire. Our desire knows no bounds and no decency, and it is constantly fed by people who wish to enslave us.
And this is
and
an old
use our
philosophical.
right. I was going to say there's a lot of Buddhism in what you just read, right?
Yeah. I mean, Descartes says at one point that it's important to understand, and this is also a Stoic idea as well, that our desire will always outstrip our understanding. But he says this is the fundamental cause of error, is when we act as if our will should listen to the desire rather than being guided by understanding. And so we start acting and living and moving because our desire knows no limits. And he says, yeah, but our understanding is very definitely limited. And so for me, the hope of the book at some level is, again, not to tell people what they should do with their lives. It's a very frustrating book. If you're looking for the 7 principles of highly happy people, and here's the number, I'm against that stuff. That's not what I do. But if you're looking for a book that maybe gives you a really good reason to take seriously the question, who am I becoming? What's worthy of my finitude? Am I okay with myself? Those questions I hope to motivate, and I name that risk with direction. That's faithfulness for me.
I think that is a perfect way to land tonight's show versus crashing into a mountain or running out of gas and crash landing. And that is we need to give your book to somebody. So there were other comments, and some of the people that we shared comments with, made additional comments. But and thank you to everybody.
Well, to that point, to everyone who made comments, we didn't get to them. Please go to my website, jaaronsimmons.com. There you can reach out to me by email. You can send me a message just through the website. And I would love to hear questions that we didn't get to, questions that our conversation has yielded. Send them to me. I will respond to you. And on that website, you can also...
Is that the right spelling of it?
That is jaaronsimmons.com. You can also get signed up for my monthly newsletter there. And then also it'll direct you over to my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, so that we can make these conversations, these ideas weekly. And you can think with me in sort of short, hopefully practical ways about how philosophy is something that hits us where we are, rather than just being something that is so abstract it calls us to somewhere else. So please do follow up with me. I would love to hear your questions. I would love to stay in touch with you.
Awesome. And we're going to have you back. But now we need to pick one of those. And I don't know if you can go from memory, if you want to see any of them again, if you want to see additional comments. There's also, there should be a toggle over to the right that you should be able to click on to see suddenly in all their glory these comments.
I do see Cameron's. That's the only one I see. Why don't we do this? Because I do not know. I know a couple of the people who were asking questions, so obviously I don't want to privilege the people who know me personally. So why don't we just go with Cameron, because that was the last question. How about that? And that way there's no randomness other than saying the last one we consider will be the one.
He also had just a brilliant comment that we didn't show before, and here it is.
Okay, awesome.
and I don't know if he was pandering. I think this was more of a pandering comment. And
and Cameron, for what it's worth, I couldn't see any of them. So I will definitely send a book to you. Make sure that the address gets to Wade so that I can get it, and I will absolutely put one in the mail to you. It'll be signed, and I'll even stick a couple swag stickers in there as well for you. And in fact, let's do that too. Whoever the Jet comment, since that was the only one that didn't have a name, so I have no idea who that is. If that person will also give their address to you and you can pass it to me, I'll make sure they get some of my stickers as well. I have an I Camp with Kierkegaard sticker, a What's Worthy of My Finitude sticker, and then also one that just has a double black diamond trail sign that says Risk with Direction. So I'll send Jet some stickers as well.
I'm just typing here. And there we go. So awesome. Thank you so much. We will take care of that, and we will have you back soon. We often conclude with a concluding video. we'll just skip that tonight and say to all of you, may God continue to bless your path. Thank you for tuning in tonight. Or if you're watching this after the fact on our YouTube channel or one of the other places where it's streamed or stored, do like, do comment, do subscribe, and we'll continue to try to bring you entertaining, challenging, educational, inspirational guests that can help provide some illumination on your path.
Well, thank you, Wade. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Dan, who got us connected. Again, I hope everything is okay with his family as they move through some difficult times. And to all of you who watched, I am in your debt. It has been wonderful walking the trails with you. It's been worthy of my finitude to hang out for an hour and 50 minutes and 9 seconds, according to the ticker that is moving in front of me. And please do follow up with me, reach out to me. I love hearing from and being in touch with folks as we think about these difficult questions that, define our existence together. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
It was a very gratuitous portion of J. Aaron Simmons tonight, a double portion. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's even an hour later out your way. It's been just a pleasure having you, and we will have you back on soon. Good night, everyone.